Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, deceptively incompetent observer of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the show today is Justin Driver, the Robert R. Slaughter Professor of Law at Yale Law School, and much more importantly, an old friend of mine. Among his many, many recognitions, Justin was appointed by President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. Did you know that his middle name is Robinette? I didn't know that. Anyway, he was appointed by President Biden to serve on the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States and is also a recipient of the American Society for Legal History's William Nelson Cromwell Article Prize, along with many other recognitions and laurels and plaudits and such. Justin is the author of two books, the first of which was The Schoolhouse Gate, Public Education, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for the American Mind, which came out in 2018. And the second of which is his new one, and the reason I'm having him on the show now, which is titled The Fall of Affirmative Action, Race, the Supreme Court, and the Future of Higher Education, which is about exactly what it sounds like it's about, affirmative action. Also the kind of birth and development of affirmative action in the judicial history of challenges to it. I forgot to bring this up during the conversation, but before we get to it, I have a slightly embarrassing thing that I want to confess that I had been meaning to remind Justin of during this conversation, but I forgot. It's from the very first time we met, I think which was in 2009 or 2010, which was over lunch in an Austin cafe or restaurant with two other guys who became, with Justin and me, a kind of regular lunchtime crew for a number of years, guys who liked talking about journalism and media and such. And I didn't know anything about Justin at the time other than vaguely that he was a professor at the law school. But that's all I knew. I didn't know what he worked on. And I didn't know that he worked in part on topics of race. That's not all he works on, but that's been a consistent thread. And I said, and I don't remember what this was in response to, but just in the flow of conversation, I said something like it felt like the conversation on race in America was kind of passé. There wasn't much interesting happening. Maybe there wasn't much interesting left to say. And again, this was 2009, 2010. And a key thing to say here is that what I'm embarrassed by in retrospect is not that I think I was wrong precisely in the comment, because even though it wasn't long after Obama's election, and obviously there was a lot of things people were saying about race at the time, what was true, I think, was that there hadn't been a super interesting new voice in the conversation in a while. There just hadn't been a new big name in the intellectual scene on race in the way that I was kind of interested in. Though obviously I was not aware of how much that whole discourse was going to blow up very soon. But it is kind of a little bit embarrassing in retrospect to realize it was a somewhat insensitive thing to say to a young academic who is planting his flag in part in that space. And it's funny to think of Justin as young, but I guess we both were young at that point. And I think that was his first official academic appointment. So sorry about that, Justin. Apparently the conversation on race was not passé. And in fact, it turned out these are various topics that Justin and I have been talking about off and on for many years. So it was a pleasure to have the excuse, the pretext of his new book to talk to him about this stuff. And his book, I should say, it was surprisingly interesting to me to read. And that's a funny thing to say about a friend's book. But it was a surprisingly interesting thing to me to read because I had been sort of thinking and reading about affirmative action for many, many, many years in what I thought was a somewhat more than casual way. I kind of felt like I knew the scene, I knew the space, but as is often the case, when you really dig into a topic or you read an actual serious book on a topic, it turns out that I didn't know nearly as much as I thought I did. So the book was interesting to read. There's just more going on there. There's more to the history of the legal debate around it than I thought. And then, of course, flowing from that, the sort of political and cultural debate. So that was interesting, and it was fun to talk to him about it. One does not always have the benefit of spitballing about a topic like this with the Robert Slaughter Professor of Law at Yale Law School, winner of the American Society for Legal History's William Nelson Cromwell Article Prize. So anyway, nice touch base with him. Fun conversation. Hope you enjoy. Peace. Justin Driver, welcome to Eminent Americans. You're hereby anointed an eminent American by the power vested in me by the spirit of the Longhorn who watches over you still, even though you left UT Austin.
Finally, it's happened. I anointed you an eminent American, about 2010 or so. So finally, turnabout is fair play.
Just by gracing me with your presence?
No, just behind your back.
We're here to talk about your book, The Fall of Affirmative Action, subtitle, Race, the Supreme Court, and the Future of Higher Education. Give me the quick backstory on the decision or the opportunity to write the book, because I feel like your big book on schools and sort of constitutional law came out not that long ago, but maybe it did come out long. When did it come out?
The first book, The Schoolhouse Gate, came out in 2018. So this one came out, obviously, September of 2025. I was actually working on another book project at the time, and I set that aside because in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision eliminating affirmative action, I feared that there would be massive declines in Black enrollment at many of our nation's finest universities. And so I wanted to use my energy to try to understand the decision and also to identify viable constitutional paths going forward for universities. And of course, that dire prediction turned out to be true. And the book has become only more relevant since I undertook it. As you know, the Trump administration is attempting to weaponize a misunderstanding of what the Supreme Court's decision actually means in an effort to lower those already depressed numbers lower still.
I have a million questions. This is a fascinating, rich topic. I mean, let's get into just your sort of perspective on it. Like if you had to give the elevator pitch for why, maybe not so much why affirmative action was worth creating, but more why it's worth defending in 2025. What's the brief version of your brief for it?
One of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to try to salute in a wholehearted fashion the incredible achievements that affirmative action delivered to American society. You know, the Supreme Court of the United States has repeatedly entertained challenges to affirmative action dating back to the 1970s. They often, before the 2023 decision, upheld affirmative action, but they did so through deeply gritted teeth with profound ambivalence. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to say that ambivalence, in effect, is unwarranted. Let me just give you a couple of snapshots to talk about how affirmative action transformed our nation. So in the fall of 1960, about 3,000 students entered Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. A grand total of 15 of those 3,000 students were Black. That means when President Kennedy delivers his inaugural speech that the torch has been passed to a new generation in American life, the composition of the leading colleges included just about no Black students whatsoever. You flash forward a decade, 1970, and those numbers are just shy of 300. So about 10% rather than 0.5%, which is what it was in 1960. And of course, what starts on college campuses does not remain there. This had cascading consequences for American society in the legal profession, the medical profession, the engineering profession, academia. One could go on and on. So I try to suggest that affirmative action belongs right up there with the GI Bill as a transformational piece of policy that improved our nation dramatically. And at the same time, I try to be a nuanced, a careful thinker. I try to complicate the conventional wisdom. And that's true in this book as well. So, you know, the first chapter in the book is saying conservatives have been pining for for the death of affirmative action for a really long period of time. This decision is actually going to make things worse from conservative lights, is, you know, chapter 1. Chapter 2, I complicate the traditional position embraced by my fellow legal liberals who have a theory of the Equal Protection Clause, and they say, under this theory, of course affirmative action is A-OK, and I say not so fast. So I am trying to be, you know, nuanced rather than just being, heaven forbid, repeating the same old arguments about affirmative action. It is a well-worn subject, but I like to think I'm saying something new.
Yeah, and you didn't even mention towards the end where you offer all of these creative opportunities for universities to pursue a variety of policies that might pass muster even under the sort of conservative Supreme Court regime that would essentially accomplish similar ends. So again, I want to get into all the sort of contemporary legal things, but even though this is a topic that's sort of debated ad nauseum, there is this part of me that feels like there's certain fundamental questions about it that actually aren't paid that much attention to because it's so fraught and because people fall into these sort of predictable grooves. I think on that question, that sort of broad question, like, was affirmative action a major accomplishment that transformed American society in a positive way? I 100% agree with you. I think I probably disagree with you, just laying the groundwork sort of in the contemporary sense, or at least on some issues. But I want to understand what that transformation was, because I think something that your book addresses and that I think confounds people in a certain way in this debate is, to what extent are we talking about the elite, right? Or to what extent are we talking about the transformation of the elite? My guess is, but you will know this better than me, that we're much more talking somewhat exclusively about the transformation of the elite or effects on the elite now than we were then. But how do we differentiate that? Because of course, like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, how much was affirmative action in play at other institutions? Like, what's the counterfactual? Let's say there's no affirmative action, but there is meaningful and real and more rigorous and disciplined enforcement of anti-discrimination statutes. So there is a process whereby all of the universities that have been actively discriminating against Black students up to that point, which is probably most of them, but there is a process whereby that discrimination is basically over the next 10 or 20 years is stamped out. Presumably, there's still massive growth in the number of Black students and whatever other protected groups at most institutions. And maybe that is there's the least transformation at the elite institutions for a variety of reasons, including that the K through 12 schooling of most or many Black students, Hispanic students, whomever else, was inferior to what the most advantaged white students have. So whatever the sort of preparation one needed in order to be competitive by traditional criteria was to the disadvantage of those students. But how much of this do you get what I'm saying? How much of this is elite? How much of it is nobody's against, maybe on some deep unconscious or unavowed level, people are against actually anti-discrimination. But at least in the public realm, we're all for kind of the rigorous enforcement of equal consideration. And where we divide is on whether there are differences in the criteria by which we're accepting different racial groups.
Great. So there's a lot there. Are we talking about the elite? Yes, we are talking about the elite. In terms of, the book is focused overwhelmingly on higher education, and most colleges and universities are not selective enrollment institutions. So I would argue, and I suspect that you would agree, that what happens on a tiny number of college campuses in the United States plays an inordinate, and by my lights, regrettable role in shaping American society as a whole. If given my druthers, my magic wand, that's not how things should be. Whether one was a really good student at age 16 should not determine whether you have an opportunity to walk the corridors of power. But that's the world that we inhabit. And I would also say that the rise of affirmative action represented an attack on the prevailing racial hierarchy in this country. I say early on in the book, borrowing from others, that it changed ideas about where Black people belong in American society. And that is no small thing. It seems to me that that is a massive transformation of American society. Okay, what would the world be like in the absence of affirmative action? Totally legit and fair question. These universities made a real effort to enroll significant numbers of Black students toward the end of the 1960s. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that in the absence of those efforts, Black students would not have been on these campuses in significant numbers. I talk about the legal profession in particular. In the absence of affirmative action, the number of Black people attending law schools would have been dramatically smaller. So the line that you're pushing is, of course, a very attractive one. Indeed, Justice Thomas embraces a version of this. He says all they did was stop stopping us, right? That there had been discrimination, they relaxed discrimination, and then we were allowed an opportunity to sort of demonstrate what we could do. It's a very attractive story, but I don't believe that the numbers bear it out.
There may be a really profound distinction also between undergraduate institutions where we kind of have a surfeit of them. We basically have enough undergraduate institutions for everybody who wants to go to college, right? And most of them are non-selective. That is not the case. That's certainly not the case with medical school. It sounds like it's not the case with law school. So it's actually a very different set of calculations. And I don't think you're saying it would have been okay if we didn't have affirmative action for undergrad, but we did it for these other professional institutions. But even there, I just want to acknowledge that distinction that, like, even if you could say, if not for affirmative action, we might have roughly the same numbers of Black students, let's say, in undergraduate college, not elite colleges, but college. Even if we could say that, and that would be roughly true, it would not be true, certainly over the course of decades, in medical schools, in law schools, maybe in business schools, and all of these other professional institutions, maybe in PhD programs or something like that, where there just simply there aren't nearly as many spots as there are, in theory, people who might want them.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. And, this argument has received some attention in legal circles. There's an argument called mismatch put forward by Richard Sander, a professor at UCLA, where he writes a Stanford Law Review article quite some number of years ago now, where he says, I thought of myself as a fan of affirmative action, but then I looked at the data, and Black law school students at elite schools are in effect promoted into academic environments for which they are ill prepared for success. And that leads to fewer Black lawyers because they fail the bar at a higher rate than had they gone to X school minus 25 slots or whatever it would be, right? Now, that argument is deeply contested from an empirical standpoint, and applies to undergraduates as well, the law is an incredibly hierarchical profession, insanely hierarchical. People care about where you go to law school 50 years after you've graduated from law school. And there are some excellent law firms that will not dare to recruit someone from merely the 10th best law school in the country. Right. I mean, like, really wild stuff. And so one might say with a straight face that it is better to be number 550 at Harvard Law School, that is to say, butt naked last in the graduating class, than it is to be valedictorian at the 15th best law school in the country. And many people would say, you don't have to go to 15.
Right. Less true at the undergraduate level, right? But at the law school level, profoundly true. I appreciate your sort of just recognition that what we're talking about is primarily elite spaces. And it's interesting to think about what the significance of that is, because to your point, the whole reason we care about the elites is because they exert massively disproportionate power and influence, right? And you said that's regrettable. I mean, I agree it's regrettable. It's probably inevitable to some extent. It doesn't have to be inevitable to the extent that it is probably at this moment in American history. And there's other countries where there's less disproportionate sort of wealth and power between the elite and the rest. I agree with you 100%. So what would society be like if we hadn't had affirmative action? You can imagine that sort of counterfactual where, again, maybe the claims that, like, affirmative action created the Black middle class, let's say, are overstated. Maybe. But the claim that, like, affirmative action helped sort of meaningfully and profoundly diversify the people who are making the decisions, exerting political power, exerting cultural power, exerting legal power, the power of legal scholarship, would be much, much whiter, much less Black, much less Hispanic, less Asian, less female, seems indisputable. And that would be a bad thing.
You and I think that it would be a bad thing.
Right. I think
we are talking at a,
maybe not Nick Fuentes.
We are talking at we are speaking at a fraught moment in American society where having dark skin is evidence of, in certain circles, presumed incompetence.
Yeah.
Maybe even an irrebuttable presumption of incompetence. But I think the presumption is, when the President of the United States blames DEI for
everything that goes wrong.
Exactly so.
Right.
Without even endeavoring to investigate matters, and claims that he is restoring meritocracy to the White House, when many people would say that his cabinet is rather strong evidence pointing in the other direction.
I have a question, and you deal with this in the book in a kind of legal sense, but I'm curious for you in a personal sense. Right? You talk about the argument. I mean, there's the mismatch argument. There's also the argument, and I don't know who makes this in the legal space, but certainly like somebody like Glenn Loury in the sort of public intellectual space makes the argument that the policy of affirmative action is it's undignified for Black people because it creates a social context in which the presumption of people who are dealing with Black people in elite spaces, which are the spaces where affirmative action operates, are presumptively less competent. I mean, you're somebody with Black skin who spent all of the last 30 years or so in exquisitely elite places, right? You were at Brown as an undergrad, and then you were at Harvard as a law student, and then you kind of ascended up the hierarchy of law schools from UT Austin to, didn't you did a little bit of Virginia, and you did like a year or a semester at Harvard, and then you were at Chicago, and then finally you were at the peak, well, the peak of the legal pyramid, which is Yale Law School. So you have been a person in possession of black skin in elite spaces for 30 years. What is your personal sense of that? Do you feel that you deal with people who presume that you are less competent?
It's a very interesting question. It's possible that things have shifted. This is my 17th year in legal academia. It's possible things have shifted during the course of that time, and that when I was lucky enough to begin my career at the University of Texas at Austin, I was a fledgling law professor where I hadn't written anything, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I hadn't taught anybody. So it's possible it was one way. This is not something that has deeply shaped my own experience of moving through the world, I guess is what I would say about that. So much so, I'll tell you a story. When I was at Harvard Law School, I was lucky enough to be on the Harvard Law Review. And Harvard Law Review had a racial affirmative action policy for an incredibly 20 years or so. It was nothing controversial. So far as I thought about it, it was just part of the standard operating procedure. At some point when I was there, very few women made the Harvard Law Review, and the entire body had a big debate about whether to have gender as a criterion for affirmative action. And that debate was fascinating because people were saying, well, the stigma of affirmative action. And I thought, well, geez, is that how y'all are looking around thinking about me?
Yeah.
Because that's not something that I sort of carried into Gannett House, where the Harvard Law Review was housed. That was not something that I felt like, as Justice Thomas would say when he was a student here at Yale Law School, that walking around the Gothic sort of architecture, every time you would walk into a class, there was a monkey that would jump down on your back and everything that would, in effect, he's suggesting, it was a burden, right? Now, Justice Thomas graduated from Yale Law School in 1974, 1 year before I was born. So there are differences there. I do try to say in the book that those who are deeply concerned about this notion of victimology and that it requires Black people to take on the mindset of victimization, I try to contend, I think persuasively, you'll tell me I'm wrong, that the Students for Fair Admissions decision by the Supreme Court in 2023 made those issues worse rather than better because, Chief Justice Roberts has in the opinion, he says you can write about this in essays, and if it's a part of individualized experiences, that it's permissible for universities to be able to take this into account for admissions purposes. And of course, those essays, because they can no longer, universities cannot access the racial checkbox data anymore during the admissions process, that is an outlet. And it requires, it strongly encourages, incentivizes people to say, nobody knows the troubles I've seen.
Right.
And we should say, by the way, if you're in a position to be applying to Harvard College or Yale College, things are going pretty well for you, actually, right? There are a lot of people who couldn't dream of even applying. And by the way, conservatives are deeply concerned not only about victimization, but about the way that race is too often the most important thing, taken to be the most important thing about us. And of course, when you're given an open-ended prompt that says, tell us about something about yourself that's important about you, and Black and brown people are incentivized to write these essays, that only underscores the idea that race defines everything about us.
It's interesting. I 100% believe you that anxiety that people might be judging you, preemptively judging you, has not been a big factor in your life. I 100% believe you because I think you share what I would call the justified arrogance that I do, which is just like you just walk into the room and you assume you're whether you're the smartest or the second smartest. I mean, who knows, right? But you're one of the top two or three. And so, I mean, one of the things that's tricky that I find so tricky is talking about the kind of race stuff when it gets to the subjective experiences. Of course, people within races have dramatically different subjective experiences, right? So Clarence Thomas in 1973, 72, 73, 74, felt the monkey jumping down on his back. Some of that was the time, but some of that was the person, right? Like some of that was the person. And You don't experience that. You know you're the smartest person in the room. I mean, at this point, I think you were kind of pointing towards this. At this point, 17 years into your career, you have been immensely productive, right? So you also carry behind you, a million law review articles in all the prestigious law review journals, 2 books. Every laurel there is in the sort of world of legal scholarship, you have trailing after you, and anybody who's walking into a room with you in a legal context will know those things about you. But there are also people like, I don't know how to think about these things because there's also a lot of racially progressive arguments that are made on the basis of people's subjective experience of walking through the world, right? So there's a lot of arguments about surrounding questions like microaggressions, let's say, that are profoundly premised on the idea that Black people or people of other, marginalized groups are walking through the world experiencing these kind of constant assault of micro injuries. And when you listen to somebody, let's say like John McWhorter or something like that, who's also somebody who walks into a room and assumes he's the smartest guy in there, he's like, this is all bullshit, right? Who cares? Like, who cares what those idiots think? And it's like, well, easy enough for John McWhorter to say because John McWhorter is temperamentally disposed to just being that way. Right. He just has a sense of security and confidence in his own capacity and to be in this space and the sort of justification of his success. Somebody else who's more vulnerable might feel totally different. And it's hard to have those kinds of conversations around what it would mean. Like, it's possible that kind of argument of sort of stigma is actually in play in some meaningful sense, and you wouldn't experience it. Which doesn't answer a question one way or the other about, whether the policy is worthwhile or not. It just makes it difficult to have a kind of coherent discussion about these things.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. You said some, I think, nice things about me a second ago, lumping me in with you.
I said it was justified arrogance.
I think nice things, so I'll say thank you, assuming it was a compliment.
It was.
Now, I want to generalize rather than talking about myself, but there are colleagues of mine who would say that affirmative action casts a long shadow over Black achievement, no matter how high you have climbed. And I mean colleagues, both in the narrow sense and in the broader sense, thinking about, say, law professors generally.
Supreme Court justices, right? I mean,
fair enough. So there are those who would say that if you are Black, there is going to be a discount taken from your achievement.
Oh, interesting.
And do you want your discount to be taken from the 10th best law school or the 3rd best law school, or do you want to go to the top?
Yep.
So there is a certain freedom that Black professionals don't enjoy because, you have to go to the highest bidder from a ranking standpoint and everything. So that is an argument, and it doesn't sound totally crazy to me.
I mean, I think you make the argument, you don't spend a lot of time on it, but I think you make the argument at one point in the book that essentially the discount is going to be taken regardless. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem evident at all. I think this is true that if you prohibit affirmative action and the numbers of Black students on campus drop, that they will actually be treated with any more presumption of equality for a variety of reasons, right?
I fear that we are entering the worst of all worlds. By that, I mean, let me give you an example. So Edward Bloom, Texas's own, who founded Students for Fair Admissions, noted after MIT, its first year class went from 15% Black to 5% Black. He said, in effect, and a good thing too, because those 5% Black students will be able to walk in with their heads held high, knowing that they made it through the front door rather than the back door. But we have lots of experiences with the end of affirmative action, including in California, which got rid of it in the 90s, where the worst of all worlds, small number of Black students, and the second thing is still a presumption of incompetence. That is to say that the Black students at Berkeley, even 20 years after the end of affirmative action, say that we weren't invited into the study groups. Our classmates would say, hey, you got in because of affirmative action, even though affirmative action had been impermissible for 20 years. And there were so few Black students when students are walking around Berkeley's beautiful campus, and there are, student organizations handing out leaflets to passersby, that they don't even attempt to give a leaflet to the student because they think if you're Black, you can't be a student at Berkeley and everything,
Yeah.
So we're not in any We're not on the cusp of entering some post-racial nirvana or anything like that. So this is the presumption of incompetence is a lot more durable than getting rid of a particular legal regime.
I mean, let's go to sort of the fundamental legal questions that the court was considering. Really, the truth is not everyone agrees that the ends of sort of rough parity in the admissions at elite institutions is desirable. But you and I agree. And I think sort of in a sort of public sense, everyone agrees, right? Everyone would want that to be the outcome, all of the things being equal. Actually, I was going to say, this would have been easier to say a few years ago. People of good character, people of good character and fundamental kind of desire for good outcomes in our society want that. But there's lots of things we want that are constitutionally impermissible. What were the legal questions? And I didn't know a lot of this stuff. It's interesting. You think you know these things, right? And then you actually go into the details of them. And I didn't really know them. I didn't really know that there were these sort of two rival interpretations of what is it of the Equal Protection Clause that have kind of been in play and given more or less emphasis over the last few decades when it comes to affirmative action. So kind of lay that out for me.
So I just want to go back for a second. I'm glad that you and I are on the same page, but I don't think that we should regard the people who want to see fewer Black students on elite college campuses as some sort of lunatic fringe. These people have their hands on the levers of governmental power right now.
Right,
Indeed, as I said earlier, the Trump administration has been wielding this interpretation of students for fair admission and is attempting to lower the number of Black students on elite college campuses. The Trump administration did, into consent decrees with Brown University and Columbia to hand over their racial data, their admissions data broken down by race for accepted and rejected applicants. Those universities both experienced staggering declines in Black enrollment post SFFA, but for many members of the Trump administration, there are too many Black students on elite college campuses.
No, you're right. I shouldn't sort of downplay that. I mean, there are clearly, and sometimes they barely even attempt to veil it, right? There's a clear desire amongst many in the administration, and certainly Trump seems somebody who just kind of holds a visceral sense that whites belong at the top of the hierarchy.
Thank you. So turning to the question that you asked about these rival theories of the Equal Protection Clause, there are ideas about anti-classification on the one hand and anti-subordination on the other. So Brown versus Board of Education offers a good example. Now here, both of the theories point in the same direction. So the anti-classification people would say, well, the problem with Brown is that it told students where they could go to school based on the color of their skin. That is to say that there were these racial classifications that were a part of Jim Crow. And so therefore, Brown was correctly decided. Anti-subordination people would say, yes, that was a problem, but they would put more emphasis on the fact that the racial lines were drawn on the basis of a belief in Black inferiority, and that this was part of a larger social system that was predicated on a notion that Black people are lesser than. So those theories point in the same direction for Brown, but the rubber hits the road when it comes to affirmative action, because if you're an anti-classification person, then you say affirmative action has got to go. And if you're an anti-subordination person, many traditional anti-subordination theorists would say, oh, affirmative action is A-OK because it's not predicated on a theory of Black subordination. To the contrary, it's trying to attack those longstanding notions. But I don't think that my fellow liberals who overwhelmingly subscribe to the anti-subordination idea, conservatives typically embrace anti-classification ideas, I don't think that they have made the case that anti-subordination necessarily means believing that affirmative action is constitutionally permissible. And one of the people who has done that work, and one of the things who I'm trying to interact with, is Justice Clarence Thomas. The Students for Fair Admissions decision uses the term anti-subordination in Justice Thomas's concurring opinion for the first time ever in the U.S. reports. And I don't think people have given Justice Thomas enough credit as a constitutional theorist as he deserves. But it's not only Clarence Thomas. Some defenders of affirmative action say, yes, there is a subordinating component, including Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School, Stephen Carter of Yale Law School, and Derek Bell, right, founder of critical race theory, says back in the 1970s, affirmative action envelops Black people in a cloud of suspected incompetence, or something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing. So many people would be astonished that, Derek Bell subscribed to that notion, but it's a lot more subordination. Anti-subordination is a lot more protean than people often allow.
Take me back a step further. So where in the Constitution is this being hashed out?
We are thinking about the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause here. Ratified in the aftermath of the Civil War, 1868 is the year, and the 14th Amendment has a couple of different provisions. One of the first sentence offers natural-born citizenship, thereby reversing the Dred Scott decision from 1857. And it also includes a due process clause, an equal protection clause, and also a privileges or immunities clause. But the real action here is the equal protection clause. The equal protection clause was not top of mind for many people in the late 19th and early 20th century. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes says in 1927 that the equal protection clause is the usual last resort of constitutional argumentation, right? You guys you're trying to make something with the equal protection clause and you're making too much. But of course, that's how Brown versus Board of Education was decided, using the equal protection clause, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and the regime of separate but equal, at least in the educational sphere. And to be frank, people were not thinking about subordination and classification in the 1950s. The arguments were not there. It's not until the 1970s, when affirmative action rises to the fore, you have to have a theory of what the equal protection clause prohibits, or some people would say what it requires. And it's Justice Lewis Powell in 1978 who writes the controlling opinion in Bakke and says, you can't have racial quotas, but racial diversity is permissible, upholding Harvard College's admissions model. It's a fascinating story because Lewis Powell was the chairman of the Richmond School Board when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. And he fought Brown tooth and nail. He is a child of the segregated South and thinks there's nothing wrong with racial segregation. And so the idea that just 5 years after joining the Supreme Court of the United States, he's going to uphold affirmative action, I mean, that he is the most improbable savior of many improbable saviors, including my old boss, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice Anthony Kennedy, and on and on. A series of Republican-appointed justices upheld affirmative action for a period of years. And so in some respects, the marvel is not that affirmative action is dead, but that it lasted for as long as it did.
So I'm trying to understand how this plays out. So we have this clause. The language is, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's it, right?
That's it.
Right. So that's so that all of this, right, is like the whole universe exists on the other side of that, right? It's not specifying in any detail what this actually means in terms of, I mean, there's certain things that we know, right? There's certain huge things that we know that it does. But when you get to something like affirmative action, I think there's also almost an implicit assumption people have that there's sort of like and I think the conservative perspective has benefited from this. The conservative case against affirmative action has benefited from an understanding of this as just a kind of clearly intuitive thing. Like people entitled to equal protection of the law. Like we don't discriminate. Why can we discriminate? Right? It's just like it's simple as that. The reality is you pass this constitutional amendment that then becomes the thing that controls, prohibits, enables all sorts of things down the line, 50, 100, 150 years down the line, that the people who passed those amendments could never have conceived of, right? They didn't want to determine anyway. They didn't want to think it was the role of the Constitution to determine every possible instantiation of something in its language, but they couldn't have even conceived of any of these things. So then there's this whole history of law that develops, and that's the situation that's confronting. There's a whole history of law, but then there's also sorts of evolutions in society and culture and politics and all that. That's the situation that the justices are confronting in Brown v. Board is decided. But even then, they're not considering something like affirmative action. And then 20 years down the road after Brown v. Board of Education, they have to decide against, in a sense, a blank slate, or at least a piece of it is blank. How does the Constitution rule on this thing, right? I mean, am I glossing it properly? Like, none of this is determined in advance.
Decidedly not. The Constitution is a famously brief document, and it's designed in often spare language, which requires interpretation. There are those who would say that we should pay much greater heed to the historical circumstances that gave birth to the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment, you read a decent portion of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, dealing with equal protection due process. The 15th Amendment dealing with voting. This is sort of a constitutional revolution that's designed to make the formerly enslaved people citizens in American society. And so there are those who would say, well, we did have these the Freedmen's Bureau adopted roughly contemporaneous in time with the Equal Protection Clause, and that should be regarded as evidence that governmental programs that are designed to help Black people pass constitutional muster.
So the originalist interpretation, which we typically think of as a sort of conservative perspective, it actually seems to lend more weight in this case to permitting affirmative action?
Justice Jackson would certainly say that. And there was a fascinating part of the opinion, including Justice Thomas's opinion, about, what does an originalist, and a majority of the Supreme Court marches behind the originalist banner right now, what does an originalist who is opposed to affirmative action do with the Freedmen's Bureau? Justice Thomas, to his credit, did wrestle with that question. And he says, oh, well, the Freedmen's Bureau, that wasn't about race, even though
it's just about enslavement.
That's right. That's the Thomas position. Even though many historians, including the great Eric Foner, would say, what are you talking about? Freedman was, of course, a racialized term. It was used synonymously with Black people. But Thomas says exactly as you say, Dan. Oh, that was about the status of having been an enslaved person. It wasn't a racial designation, but that does open the window, and this came up during oral argument, and I talk about it in my book. Justice Kavanaugh jumped in when this issue arose at oral argument, and he said, but that means that preferences for the descendants of enslaved persons are also not racial categories.
Yeah, and this gets into some of those, that's interesting, this gets into some of those solutions that you offered at the end, which is that if you can create categorizations that are not specifically racial, but that could sort of, based on the numbers of, how people fit into those classes, could privilege Blacks, Hispanics, whomever, that would be constitutionally permissible. I think there's a kind of pragmatic question of, whether the justices, as they're constituted right now, would accept that argument, but you're just saying it's consistent with their reasoning.
I want to be clear about a couple of things. One is I am adamantly opposed to defiance of the Supreme Court of the United States. There are some people who write in this area who say, oh, these universities should just disregard what the Supreme Court says and just whatever it takes. Count me out of that project. We have a history of people defying the Supreme Court of the United States. It's not an honorable history in my estimation. At the same time, I also don't want people to overinterpret what the decision says. I try to read the decision seriously, being an honest broker. My best reading of what Chief Justice Roberts says is that what's prohibited is race qua race or race for the sake of race. I marshal arguments, including from the mighty Justice Antonin Scalia, who says, listen, many programs that may arise in the aftermath of affirmative action, they may disproportionately favor Black people. I wouldn't care if they favored exclusively Black people. What's prohibited is treating people differently on the basis of their race. And so I take that on, and I try to take seriously what Justice Thomas and Justice Kavanaugh were doing at the Supreme Court. And, all we can do is take the Supreme Court justices at their word. And by the way, Georgetown University has already enacted a policy of this sort, offering preferences to the descendants of enslaved persons. They were limited to people who were actually enslaved as part of Georgetown University.
Oh, which is a very small number of people, right?
A very small number. I applaud them for taking that first step. That seems quite honorable. It's, in my view, too parsimonious, though, about who is afforded the benefit, because by my lights, one of the central horrors of slavery was that it turned individual souls into fungible commodities, and the presumption of fungibility should be extended to the descendants of the enslaved as well. So I do think it's possible that the Supreme Court of the United States would say, yeah, this is a different kettle of fish.
if the originalist perspective is not particularly favorable to the prohibition of affirmative action, what was the kind of theoretical framework that most of the conservative justices adopted in order to find against it?
Yeah, so Chief Justice Roberts writes the opinion, and he really is embracing color blindness. He says, in that opinion, eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. So, this sort of resonant language, this is a form of racial discrimination. He doesn't actually mean it, by the way, in the sense that the fourth footnote of the opinion says, well, Annapolis and West Point, those may be different. And so we're not really reaching that question here. And then he also says it's not absolute colorblindness because, as I've already said, there's this carve out for these essays and everything. And parenthetically, we should also say here that nobody actually believes in absolute colorblindness in all spheres. Let me give you an example that I give to my students. Imagine that you're dealing with the LAPD and they are trying to infiltrate a racially identifiable gang, the Bloods or the Crips. And the person who has the most experience going undercover is Officer Sven Johansson, right? Officer Johansson off to infiltrate the Bloods. That's a suicide mission, right? Nobody believes that that's required. Of course, race can be considered, and so it's a question of when the government can consider race.
That's also, by the way, the premise for a movie that's in development in Hollywood, I think.
That's right. White Chicks Part 2, right? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so what Chief Justice Roberts really is animated by, and I actually got a foretaste of this when I was a law clerk at the Supreme Court of the United States. We had a case called Parents Involved in 2007, which dealt with voluntary desegregation programs that were adopted by Louisville and Seattle, where in some instances, they did take account of individual students' race in order to promote racial integration. And so Chief Justice Roberts wrote an opinion there that said, in effect, this is Brown Part 3, I suppose. That is to say, what happened in Brown, students were told where they could go to school based on the color of their skin. These programs tell students where they can go to school based on the color of their skin. Even if it's for a different purpose, it nevertheless makes no difference for constitutional purposes.
I mean, is this one of these situations like the sort of creation of, I think this was Roe v. Wade, like the kind of right to privacy, where justices identify in this sort of larger holistic sense certain underlying principles that are allowed to be determinative in cases, even though it's not necessarily like the specific thing that was elucidated in any of in the Constitution and its amendments itself? Like, because Roberts, and this isn't the first time. I mean, wasn't there there was another line in one of the affirmative action cases that was like, the way to stop discriminating on race is to stop discriminating on race, which is very similar to that line you quoted. But I think that was a separate instance. I mean, Justice Roberts seems to feel pretty vehemently that there is that sort of principle. But from what you're saying, that doesn't exist in a sort of verbatim sense in any of the relevant law.
Well, that's right. The line that you paraphrased is, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. He writes that in the Parents Involved case in 2007, and then remixes it in effect, right, in Students for Fair Admissions. And so he would be saying, well, I am a judge, and I, of course, am focused on the text of the Constitution. He might say, oftentimes, with you, the text of the Constitution doesn't carry you very far. And so I am attempting to extract principles from the Supreme Court's jurisprudence that apply in these instances. And so he would say, I am building on Brown, and I am building on Parents Involved. And, this is a larger generalizable principle, and there's nothing untoward about that. I disagree with him vehemently on this opinion. And it is true that a central project for Chief Justice Roberts is this racial colorblindness. He's done this in the Voting Rights Act context as well. And, Chief Justice Roberts has a reputation as being an incrementalist, an institutionalist, but this is one instance where he's really in a hurry.
What's the short version of your case against Justice Roberts and or Justice Thomas or whomever in this case? What's your argument that the Constitution does not prohibit affirmative action?
I think the strongest case would be to get rid of thinking about what the Equal Protection Clause prohibits and instead think about what the Equal Protection Clause requires.
Hmm.
And I would offer an integrationist conception of the Equal Protection Clause. That may sound like a crazy radical idea, but there is a tradition of this way of seeing things. Justice Lewis Powell, who I've already mentioned, offered a version of this idea in a case called Keyes versus Denver in the early 1970s, where he said we should get beyond this de jure, de facto distinction. Powell was writing very much as a proud Virginian, and he says, hey, you're treating Atlanta one way, and you could be treating a northern city in a very different way because of the existence, even though the racial patterns look quite similar. And we should get out of that business. And instead, it should be incumbent upon these school districts to take affirmative steps to sort of have greater amounts of integration. So I'm sure that there would be all sorts of implementation difficulties with this integrationist impulse. But I think that that would be the sort of strongest justification. And another thing to say, I co-authored a piece in the Columbia Law Review called Assessing Affirmative Action's Diversity Rationale with some empirically sophisticated co-authors. And one of the things that Chief Justice Roberts says in his opinion is he says, well, how can we tell whether affirmative action is working, or when can we tell when we're done? Justice Alito said there's no metric to measure this. We did this study that looked at law reviews and citations, and we paid attention to the adoption of affirmative action policies at these various law reviews that happened over a long period of time, and we found an actual statistically significant increase in the citations. So this idea that we can't measure it is incorrect. So I would probably try to have mashed some version of those things together in order to make the case.
So you find in the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, an actual affirmative, mandates may be too strong, an affirmative purpose to further the cause of racial integration in America. Do you really want to say that it requires affirmative action? Because I would think what it would mean, even if you accepted that argument, is it requires in some just sort of vaguely specified way that the state is responsible for furthering kind of racial integration, but not necessarily what those policies would be. Does that exist in sort of Supreme Court jurisprudence, that sort of integrationist? Where are you getting that? And where else does it live in kind of, whether it's in political theory or in constitutional history or in, law journals or whatever?
Powell wrote about it as a sort of, requirement, right? That if there were racial disparities in the schools throughout the nation, then it would have been incumbent upon the schools to take steps to redress that. Another way to frame it, as you're suggesting, though, would be that it's not required, but it's permissible for universities to be able to take these steps.
Because the segregation is proof positive that equal protection is not being applied? Is that the reasoning?
That would have been Powell's reasoning, yes. But there have been other Supreme Court opinions where people would talk about, the sort of democratic justification for affirmative action, that to have a group of people more or less excluded from the universities that walk the corridors of power is a very uncomfortable thing for a nation that styles itself a democracy. You can see this in Justice Breyer's writing, my old boss, or Justice O'Connor's opinion in 2003, also my old boss. So there's a way to understand that. And I do think that that is a really compelling justification. Let me just tell you, people who might be regarded as recipients of affirmative action have made, tremendous contributions to American society. Rather than viewing this as like, a handout or somebody's spot was taken, I was recently corresponding with a member of the Yale class of 69, I believe it was. And this person was telling me when he arrived on campus as a first year that there were like 6 Black students in the graduating class, the class of 66 or something like that. And his class included 90 Black students. That 90 Black students included Henry Louis Gates Jr., Sheila Jackson Lee, Democratic elected official, Kurt Schmoke, the first Black mayor of Baltimore and a leader in higher education, Ben Carson, a cabinet secretary, Linda Darling Hammond, who's a giant in the field of education. She wrote a wonderful book. Stanford professor. It's called Other People's Children, really terrific book. There's a guy called Anthony Davis who won the Pulitzer Prize in music. The idea that this incredible cadre didn't bring luster to mighty Yale University and to our larger nation is difficult for me to entertain.
Well, I guess I'm trying to think, but is that an argument for? See, seems like that would be not dependent on affirmative action, but just sort of vigorous anti-discrimination. Because if you're talking about 90 students, and you and I have been in these institutions, right? It is only like the 90 students who are the ones who go on to contribute to. I'm exaggerating, but I'm saying there's like the exceptional students, and then there's the sort of filler. And I include myself in that filler. Let me be clear, but I'm saying I would think just rigorous application of anti-discrimination would get you 90 students. It would probably get you a few hundred students. It just wouldn't get you. It would get you 5% of the class. Maybe it wouldn't get you 10% of the class or 12% of the class or something like that.
Well, 90 students at that time would have been about 10%.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Of Yale College? Yeah, it was smaller than Harvard.
Right. I guess
Harvard
that's right.
had. Yeah. So no, this is that was a bumper crop.
Let me ask you about the diversity argument. My understanding of the diversity rationale is that it's better for the educational experience of the students to be surrounded by, but the arguments that I'm hearing you make are not precisely that. You're making, on the one hand, you're making an argument when you're talking about those 90 students that that's sort of the benefit to the nation, right? So the benefit of sort of diverse classes in elite institutions to the national good. And then the law review one is kind of a different argument. It's about the quality of the scholarship in some sense, right? I mean, am I right that those are not precisely the arguments that were made in these kind of 5-4 decisions you were talking about where sort of center-right justices were allowing this sort of continuation of affirmative action?
Yeah, so very helpful. It's Lewis Powell, again, who came up with this diversity rationale. He was unable to convince anyone to join his opinion in 1978. So there were 4 justices who said that even UC Davis Medical School's quota was permissible. There were 4 who said, no, that's impermissible. And Justice Powell, writing only for himself, said diversity is the rationale. And this idea has been beaten up pretty vigorously in sophisticated circles. But it's been embraced by the Supreme Court of the United States, certainly in the Grutter opinion, and also, I think, deeply embraced by universities who I don't think that they're just trying to give lip service here. I think that they really did take this on in a significant way. The line that's one of the lines that's famous from Justice Powell is he's sort of quoting from an amicus brief. And he says, the farm boy from Idaho can bring something to Harvard College that the Bostonian cannot. And that the same is true for a black student in comparison to a white student. And so you're exactly right that there is. And by the way, Lewis Powell said, no, racial remediation for slavery or current racism, totally impermissible. He shut the door on a number of things. And some people have questioned this idea about whether there actually are educational benefits. Some powerful people have said, this is very unattractive from the perspective of black students. The idea that I'm there to coach you up and to enhance your educational experience, count me out of that project, So people say that with some force. You asked about the Columbia piece that we did, assessing affirmative action's diversity rationale. We sort of make the case that Lewis Powell has been beaten up unfairly, and that when the board decides what articles to take on, these are groups of students who are working together and collaborating and trying to determine. And the pieces, my empirical friends are very sophisticated in terms of all sorts of controls, trying to make sure that they weren't taking more, say, con law pieces that are highly cited in comparison to tax pieces and these sorts of things. And we say the sort of experience that's happening on law reviews actually is a reasonably good approximation for what's happening in the classroom and in group work. Now, if you're talking about diversity in law schools, the strongest example perhaps would be in a criminal procedure class when you're talking about, say, racial profiling, and to have, no black students in the class. So that's one example. But people on my side need to think about other examples. What's the African American perspective on physics, on astrophysics, right? I mean, so we shouldn't think that the law school is the world.
The administrators, the admissions folks at these universities, you said they're sincere in their belief in diversity. I think that's true to an extent. I guess the question is, Are they sincere in their belief in the diversity rationale that it's kind of beneficial to their students? I guess what I would say, and of course you're just kind of reading minds at this point. You're not even reading minds, you're reading unconsciouses, right? Because there's sort of like, there's ideology at play here and there's self-deception. They believe in the role that like diversity plays in the perpetuation of the American elite or something like that. On some level, their role is to compose a class that is optimally engineered to sort of perpetuate their self-interest as an institution that fosters the American elite and that raises the most amount of money or something like that. And that they sincerely believe that having a good degree of racial balance is hospitable to that end. And that if they were too white, let's say, or actually like maybe too Asian, whichever one of those things it is, there's some sense that that goal would be compromised. And I wonder if you could actually make that case. Could you actually make the case constitutionally for the desirability of a racially diverse elite?
That's an interesting question. I would say that they are thinking maybe about the educational experience, but also the social experience. And I do think that there's a driving idea that Harvard College, without an appreciable number of Black students, would just feel wrong somehow in some deep way. But I don't think that this desire to have certain aspects of demographics map onto the larger country is totally made up or something like that. That is to say, thinking about the gender context, as you know, Yale College, way too late, was all male, but eventually they welcome women, and there's an idea, of course, Yale College needs to have 50% women, and that it would be wrong. And these days, by the way, we see universities offering boosts to male students because there's this idea that might be difficult to articulate. Why should it matter whether Tulane is 2/3 women versus 1/3 men on some level? I mean, why should that be something?
I mean,
But
they're allowed to do all of these different things where they privilege athletes. They can privilege, people who are remarkable painters and people who've founded nonprofits and run for office, somehow. And they can privilege legacies, right? Whose only virtue, and I'm one of them, whose only virtue is that their parents or their grandparents. And they can privilege the children of wealthy donors because Dr. Dre gave 10 or $20 million to USC and then they let his daughter in, right? Like they can do all sorts of things that maybe in some sense offend against some sort of very pure sense of kind of equal treatment or something like that in order to compose the class of students they want. It doesn't seem non-intuitive that they should also be able to privilege certain students on the basis of their skin color for a similar just kind of gut reason. The problem it runs into is whether or not that the rest of those things are not potentially prohibited by the Constitution, right?
absolutely, that is what Justice Thomas would say, and many other people would say. Hey, legacies may be a horrible idea, but horrible idea does not mean that it is unconstitutional, right? And that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause says something special about race, and therefore, we should be careful. Justice Scalia used to say that all new judges should get a pad of ink and get a rubber stamp that says, and on the rubber stamp, it should say stupid but constitutional, right? That if you're doing your job properly, you should regularly be using that stamp to say stupid but constitutional. I do want to say a couple of things. One is, I do try to take very seriously the Asian American claims that were at the center of Students for Fair Admissions. A lot of liberals try to brush that aside. And I bring that to the fore and say that you can't really understand the arguments that they're making without thinking about anti-subordination language and the way that Asian American people are being treated as perpetually foreign, and some of the vicious stereotypes that were understood to be applied to Asian Americans echoed the ugly stereotypes, nasty anti-Semitic ideas from 100 years earlier.
Grave grinds.
So, yeah, exactly.
No
right.
personality, not well-rounded, not naturally gifted. They're not possessing of sprezzatura or something like that. They grind it out.
I really do try to bring those ideas seriously. Some people have said that assuming that there was discrimination against Asian Americans, that one can simultaneously oppose that discrimination and simultaneously be in favor of affirmative action. And that's a long way of saying, well, maybe white students are being artificially propped up with their percentage of the class, So that's an argument that has been made. The other thing I want to say is thinking about, Bill Clinton used to say he wanted a cabinet that looked like America, right? I mean, and that in some respects, universities have sort of taken that on board along certain dimensions, including with respect to students from modest backgrounds. This is a big idea in this space. Sort of class, not race, is how this is often, rendered. I'm unconvinced that, although I applaud those efforts, I'm unconvinced that, to the extent that one is focusing on racial diversity, that class, not race, is going to get the job done. Indeed, Princeton's class of 2029, which just is completing its first semester, as you and I are talking right now, had more students from modest backgrounds than ever before in Princeton's history, more recipients of Pell Grants, and that's awesome. Good for Princeton, President Eisgruber and his team there. They also had fewer Black students than they have had since the 1960s. And so this notion that a rising tide lifts all boats is inaccurate. Yes, Black people are disproportionately poor, but there are a lot of poor white people out there. So we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that there are going to be totally clean, easy solutions out there. If there were, California would have solved this problem in 1997.
Right. Up to the age of probably 25 or 30, I'm now 49. I think I would have been aligned with your perspective, on balance, affirmative action. It's not, and I don't think anybody totally thinks it's ideal, right? Like you wish there was some other different set of principles that would achieve the same ends that didn't kind of cut the way this one did. But I would have said, look, it's not ideal, but policies rarely are, right? They're all trade-offs. This one seems worth it. At some point along the way, and I'm not sure, I'm being deliberately kind of non-systemic because it really was a growing intuition. What I started to feel was it was a kind of uniquely toxic policy or a uniquely divisive policy to the body politic in some sense. As this was not a constitutional argument, it wasn't even really an argument of principle. It was an intuition that there was something offensive about it to the body politic. And I guess by that, I probably mean the white body politic, although it ended up being Asian too. But I think the people, like the push against affirmative action is all tied up with like white racial grievance, right? I'm not diminishing the feelings of Asian people, but the political energy is coming from kind of white racial grievance, I think, or something like that. I just had this intuition that there's all sorts of other kinds of policies. And again, you get into the class thing, right? Like Social Security, like there's all sorts of sort of non-racial policies, welfare state policies that disproportionately tend to help Black people, Hispanic people, other groups, Native Americans and things like that, but that don't intensify a sense of racial division or racial grievance as opposed to affirmative action. And I remember having the thought at some point that in the last few years, I mean, before the decision that prohibited affirmative action in higher education, but not too long before it, that was like what broke it was basically the growth in Asian immigration, right? And the success of Asian American, first, second generation students. And that what was simply not viable was places like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton preferring the upper middle class children of Black and Hispanic parents, doctors and lawyers, over Asian students, whose parents ran a laundromat, who didn't, who were sort of genuinely poor and working class, who had busted their ass to get whatever they wanted to get the GPAs, to get the SAT scores, have all the extracurriculars, all the things, right? But then you're giving a boost to kids who went to Andover or something like that, whose parents were doctors, whose parents went to Yale and Harvard or something like that. And you're letting them into me that like fundamentally politically, that was not a kind of viable solution anymore. Viscerally, it seemed too wrong. That's not a constitutional argument. That's just a sort of political, social argument. And I'm saying, like, in a sense, my argument is when I say it's like, it's politically toxic, what I'm ultimately saying is it's actually hostile to the ends that I think you and I, as good liberals, want, right? More equality, greater distribution of power, because it is going to produce these backlashes, because it's going to create division amongst lower class Blacks and lower class whites who otherwise could be allied in sort of political coalition. But it's like, essentially in a vulgar way, it's going to produce the Trumps of the world or something like that, or give them more energy. And so that if what we want is greater equality, we should get rid of affirmative action and focus on other kinds of policies that are less politically toxic. Does that seem like a plausible argument to you?
So I would say a few things. One is on the racial grievance point, racial grievance, white resentment, I think, has never been higher in the United States than in this moment that we are talking right now, in our lifetimes, I should say. Now, affirmative action is dead and, has been for more than 2 years now. So the idea that affirmative action was stoking racial resentment, I think I'm not sure that I'm on board there. There is obviously a deeply unattractive view that I know that you would violently disagree with, that, this is a white man's country, replacement theory.
I do. Yes, let me just say explicitly.
You violently disagree with that,
right.
But that's...
I mean, out of self-interest, if nothing else, because I think this is a white man's country also means this is a white Christian man's country, right? Like, I think my people are also not entirely welcome in that.
There may be some ellipses along the way there. It's true. When it's a white man's country, there may be some other people who are excluded, to put it mildly.
I mean, I don't think your point about, like, racial resentment has not suddenly evaporated in the aftermath of this is that decisive, right? I mean, it's 2 years after we're dealing with what's clearly a backlash, driven in part by white racial resentment to, the woke tide of the last decade, right? I mean, these things take time to dissipate.
Well, I'm unconvinced. And let me tell you why. The people who are, let's call them tiki torchers for short.
Groypers. Don't we call them groypers now? We call them groypers.
Okay,
that's the new
whatever
term.
You call them. Come on, man. You think that those people are brimming with resentment because they've got their eyes set on Yale College and they have to go to GW instead, and that's what's really driving this? I mean, I think that this is much more...
I think there's the 20% who are like the deplorables, right? And they're just like the hardcore base. It's about the sort of, the 20% in the middle, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump voters or something like that, I think. I think what we're seeing now is much more a consequence of, to the extent that it's racial, I think it's a consequence not of affirmative action per se, but of stuff that's, happened in the last, even if you buy my theory, it's the Great Awakening, right? It's Black Lives Matter, it's, the gender stuff, it's all of the things. Affirmative action preceded that, and I think... Although I think there was probably, as part of all of that, I don't know the numbers, you probably do, there was probably an acceleration of it at certain points. Like there probably was, if you look at the numbers, at Harvard, there probably was a different percentage in, 2022 or something at peak woke than there was in 2012. I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure. That's my intuition, that it was a part of it, but I don't think it was the whole of it. It's more just that affirmative action seemed like the one policy that there were a range of things that the state did that were sort of, explicitly or implicitly towards advancing, some degree of racial inequality and racial integration. It seemed like the one that was the most provocative in a sense.
I hear you. Let me just say a couple more things, and I actually have a question for you. So two things. One, wealthy Black people are being advantaged by affirmative action. The child of a physician, the Obama daughters, right? So if I say a few things about that, one is higher education is suffused with privilege in the form of, as you suggested earlier, niche sports and the donor class, and even the ability to write your essay about how you volunteer after school rather than working at goddamn McDonald's is privilege, actually, right? And so why should we be surprised that it's privileged Black people who are often benefiting from affirmative action?
Well, we shouldn't, but again, this is why I was saying I wasn't making it from a position of principle. Like the son of a Nigerian doctor has absolutely every right to the privilege he gets, as I did to the privilege I got by virtue of being the son of somebody who went to Yale. Like, it's not a question of principle. It's a question of perception and its political consequences. But I hear what you're saying, right?
Well, it's just like, but how much should one push back against? There goes those wealthy Black people getting ahead. Like, there's so many inequalities that exist in American society. And so maybe one should be skeptical of the outsized attention that this relatively modest policy, in terms of the numbers who are affected, has attracted in American society. And as you also suggested, all policies are going to be over-inclusive and under-inclusive, right? And the question is, how many Obama daughters are out there? For my own part, I'm not from a wealthy background, to put it mildly. I don't remember looking around at Brown or Harvard Law School and saying, "Oh, these wealthy black people, what are they doing here?" And letting the real black people, And by the way, if the strongest justification for racial affirmative action is racial remediation, well, last time I checked, wealthy black people are still black people, and
Right.
so why should we begrudge them? But the question I have for you, and then I know you've got to run. You're sitting right there in the great state of Texas, where I spent 5 very happy years. I miss Austin dearly, a great city, and the University of Texas was a wonderful place. University of Texas, in the aftermath of the Hopwood decision in 1996, adopted, as you well know, the Texas 10% plan, whereby graduates of Texas public schools who were part of the top 10%, although the percentage shifted over time, were guaranteed a place. What do you make out of that policy in terms of the resentment point? You're privy to some cookouts and some barbecues where people may really let it rip, I suspect. I don't know. How do you think about that? Because
I'm not. And I say that almost with a degree of sadness because I would at least like to sort of understand the other side. I feel like I don't. So I will give you my perception, which is it feels like a much more stable and less politically volatile policy. I think because, and again, I don't know if if it's scalable because there are probably unique aspects to sort of Texas demographics and geographical distribution that make it work. The reason that I think it's persisted is because it's also been a boon to a lot of rural areas of Texas. So there's this sort of interesting politics to it where it has been maintained, and I don't see any reason why it won't be over many conservative administrations, right? And it is a kind of affirmative action. I mean, it's affirmative action for essentially kids who don't go to the more elite public schools, right? So if you go to the like my daughter did and my son does to the selective magnet academic high school in Austin, it's much harder to get into UT under this plan than if you go to the high school in some part of rural Texas or something like that. So, what I would say is it does not produce as much racial equity as a straight racial affirmative action plan would produce. It produces more than probably the alternative if it was just GPA and test scores or something like that. I guess it seems to me like a good middle ground. In Texas, it seems like it produces a good amount of I think now the entering classes at UT Austin, white students are still the plurality, but they're less than 50% white. And then amongst Asians and Hispanics and blacks and a very small number of Native Americans. So it's a majority minority, but whites are still by a considerable amount the largest plurality. And it seems politically stable and non-divisive. Has that turned Texas itself into a kind of racial utopia? Like obviously not, but it seems like a kind of a good compromise.
it's a fascinating policy, and I agree with you. There's sort of this strange bedfellows phenomenon where you have urban legislators and rural legislators finding common ground and saying the University of Texas should be for all of us in Texas rather than being reserved for suburbanites from Houston and Dallas and San Antonio, right? I mean, at the same time, some people would say, wait a minute, taking 10% as our plan, being number 49 in a class of 500 at LBJ Houston, I don't know if there is such a school, but let's say that there is, inner city high school, that's no great achievement. And, there were these stories that perhaps apocryphal that black student from excellent Texas suburban high school, very good student in the AP classes, but a member of the top 15% rather than the top 10%. And that person had to go to a lesser place of higher education called Johns Hopkins, and then it does raise interesting questions and profound questions about what is a university for? What is a state university for? Some people would say, when they're being candid, the University of Texas isn't as good as it used to be because many of by which they mean they're not filled with the leading academic lights from the state, because those folks are leaving the state, and you're getting some people would go even further and saying, actually, you're setting back the cause of racial equality, because people are going to say, hey, Mr. 15% from fancy suburban school would be actually a more able student to really thrive here than number 49 in a class of 500 from, we're calling it LBJ Houston. So it's really, you and I aren't going to solve this problem right now, but
Well, I mean,
yeah.
let me ask you I want to close it out by just thinking about the future a little bit, because I think one of the things that you touch on that I've thought a lot about is we shouldn't act as though GPA and test scores were handed down by God as the only correct and proper way to determine who should be accepted into. Like that, those are somewhat, I mean, they're not utterly arbitrary, but they're somewhat arbitrary in a sense, right? There's a parallel timeline in which the SAT doesn't exist, right? Like, so all of these things, like, because a lot of what you're talking about at the end of the book is what, how could universities reconstitute their admissions process such that I realize you don't want them to defy the spirit of the Supreme Court ruling, but such that they produce a different kind of outcome in terms of their admissions while abiding by, the Supreme Court's ruling. And you do get into these sort of fundamental questions, and I'm totally okay with that, right? And I'm okay with colleges coming up with different answers to those questions. I think it'll take some time. Unfortunately, we're going to be in a period, and you can see this in what you said, as you were saying, what the Trump administration is doing, where any alternative regime anybody comes up with will be treated by certain people as just an effort to racially engineer their class by other means, by sort of ostensibly neutral but really, racially motivated regimes. There's no way to avoid that. I think there will be inevitably some bad faith in what the universities are doing. I'm not against, nor do I think you're against, kind of rethinking the whole thing from the ground up about what it is that universities are doing and what their admissions criteria should be.
Yes, let me say very briefly here, because I am due at Sally's to pick up some pizzas, and I'll have an unhappy family if I don't get out of here pretty soon. But yeah, I think that universities should contemplate what they're doing. They should not allow themselves to be intimidated by the Trump administration's suggestions that if they were, for example, the Trump administration says, to get rid of standardized testing with an eye toward increasing racial diversity, then that would be impermissible itself. And the Supreme Court opinion says nothing of the kind. And so this is an opportunity for reinvention. And I'll mention a couple of the policies that I talk about very briefly. I already mentioned the preferences for the descendants of the enslaved. They should also contemplate what I call the fall and rise of box checking, where you might consider asking students, were you born to unwed parents? Did you grow up in a single parent household? Did your family rent rather than owning their homes? Did you have a close relative who is incarcerated? One virtue of this, that's not race. It's not race qua race. You could check it relatively quickly. The temptation that a lot of universities have succumbed to is to ask people to write yet another essay. You just went through this process. I think that people don't want to write a lot of college essays and everything. And so I fear that that's going to lead
Also,
to
with
problems.
AI, I don't even know how.
Oh, boy. That's a whole nother thing. Yeah. So there's that. There's also, I would encourage universities, elite universities, to form closer partnerships with schools that don't have a long track record of sending students to the flagship school. So I talk about the University of Chicago's South Side and Stanford's East Palo Alto and Georgetown's Anacostia, my own hometown of Washington, D.C. As you know, for a long time, many universities have had close partnerships with schools, but it's not places in their immediate vicinity, and that's not sort of race qua race. And then the other thing that universities should really consider doing would be to adopt something called the Opportunity Atlas. This is a device that was put together by Raj Chetty of Harvard and John Friedman of Brown that really does grab census tract data, neighborhood by neighborhood, to look at incarceration rates and teen pregnancy rates and these sorts of things. And then I would also suggest, though, the tweak that I would have on these sorts of things is to say that we should reinstitute a quota for people from low opportunity areas, not a racial quota, but a low opportunity quota of, say, 10%, and that 80% of those students should come from urban areas and 20% from rural areas. And I haven't just pulled those numbers out of my hat. The census tells me that 80% of Americans live in urban areas and 20% live in rural areas. And so that would have a desirable consequence and outcome on our college campuses. And it is completely justifiable by the Supreme Court of the United States, at least as currently constituted.
I think maybe I have more cynicism when it comes to kind of the motives or the sort of underlying sociological motives of some of these institutions. And I think I kind of buy some of the critiques in books like We Were Never Woke, like the Musa al-Gharbi critique, or like some of these, that essentially a lot of these institutions were engaged in a project of kind of laundering of inequality, like fundamental inequality via sort of elite racial diversity or something like that. What I was going to say, you don't have to buy that, but what I was going to say is I hope that institutions, as they're moving forward, actually seriously think about all of those things and try to not, on some level, just reconstitute affirmative action by other means, but actually think about what it is they're trying to do. What should they have been trying to do with affirmative action, and what their goals should be in terms of what kind of society we live in, and not think of it as like the desirability is ultimately just kind of like an aesthetic phenomenon where it feels wrong to walk around Harvard and see too few Black people. That like, let's actually think about the poor white folks in Appalachia, or the Asian kids, whose parents are genuinely working class, and all of those things. And that what we want, what we ultimately want, is a kind of functioning, relatively harmonious, pluralistic, multiracial democracy. And that to the extent that sort of affirmative action elite institutions was a kind of way of protecting those institutions from taking responsibility for the entirety of that, they should maybe rethink some things at a foundational level, and not just say bad Trump administration, bad John Roberts, white racial grievance, that there's more going on here than that.
I agree with you that these excellent universities are engines of mobility, and that many of the people who would stand to benefit the most, by which we mean here people from relatively modest circumstances, have not been present in sufficiently large numbers. And of course, affirmative action has been subjected to critiques from the left for a very long period of time, saying that it puts a pretty face on a pretty ugly situation, and that if you are a Black person growing up on the south side of Chicago, who goes to the U of C is not especially high on your list, of priorities. I guess I would also say, though, some people would suggest that affirmative action has been too late of an intervention in society, right? That this is when people are 18 or 25. It's just a little too late. And therefore, we need to redouble our efforts to address some of these horrible inequities that are pervasive in our nation's educational system. I'm sympathetic to that critique, but the trouble is I don't see people making any moves in an effort to, funnel money or energy or much of anything to actually address that. And now that affirmative action is no more, I haven't seen people rolling up their sleeves and saying, now we need to really get serious. So the idea that these things, that the one was preventing the other, strikes me as fantastical. Dan, this has been so wonderful, but I really should hop.
Yep. All right. Well, let's talk again soon. Congratulations on the book. Fun talking.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Talk to you later.
This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to my editor, producer extraordinaire, Robert Scaramuccia. Big thanks as well to Alec Ownsworth of Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah, for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you liked what you heard, and I imagine you did, if you've made it this deep into the episode, then please rate us on whatever the relevant podcasting platform is. And if you have any questions or comments, email me at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond at least until the faraway and probably mythical day when I have such a vast audience that I can't in good conscience respond to all the emails while still upholding my responsibility to my loved ones. Have a great day.